My brother-in-law Marcus looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're setting her up for failure. She'll never make it in the real world." I wish I could say that was the worst part, but it wasn't. 2 hours later, my own mother pulled me aside at my daughter's graduation party and whispered, "Maybe it's time to accept reality, Karen. Some kids just aren't built for success." I remember standing there in my own backyard, surrounded by celebration decorations I'd hung myself, feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. My chest was tight, not because I was surprised, but because even on what should have been Riley's proudest day, they still couldn't see her worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Karen. I'm 41. I'm a dental hygienist, a single mom, and apparently, according to my family, the woman who refuses to face facts about her daughter's limitations. To them, I've always been the one who dreams too big, the sister who pushes too hard, the mother who can't accept that some children just aren't destined for greatness. They've been shaking their heads at me since Riley was old enough to struggle with reading. But this story isn't really about me and their doubt. It's about my daughter Riley, and the moment she proved that sometimes the biggest dreamers are the ones who change the world. Riley is 18 now. She just graduated from Lincoln High School with a 2.3 GPA, and to most people, that number tells a story of failure. But I know a different story. I know about the dyslexia diagnosis in 2nd grade that made every homework assignment feel like climbing Mount Everest. I know about the anxiety that made her hands shake during every test, no matter how much she studied. I know about the ADHD that made sitting still in a classroom feel like torture, and the depression that hit her junior year when she started believing what everyone whispered about her being slow or not college material. But I also know about the heart that beats inside my daughter's chest. Riley sees the world differently than most people. Where others see problems, she sees solutions waiting to be discovered. Where others see obstacles, she sees opportunities to prove that there's more than one way to be brilliant. She's been building websites since she was 12, not because anyone taught her, but because she taught herself by watching YouTube videos and reading forums late into the night. She's created apps that her friends actually use, designed graphics that local businesses have bought, and written code that would make computer science majors jealous. But none of that mattered to my family. All they saw was the GPA. All they heard were the guidance counselor's suggestions about realistic career paths and technical schools that might be a better fit. All they focused on were the colleges that said no, not the passion that burned bright in Riley's eyes every time she talked about technology and innovation. The graduation party was supposed to be a celebration. I'd planned it for weeks, sent invitations to all our family and friends, decorated our small backyard with silver and blue streamers that matched Riley's school colors. I'd ordered a cake with "Congratulations, Riley, the sky's the limit," written in beautiful script across the top. Looking back now, that message feels prophetic, but at the time, it felt like wishful thinking in the face of so much doubt. Riley had been quiet all morning, which wasn't unusual. Big social events always made her nervous, especially when she knew people would be asking about her plans for the future. She'd spent the morning in her room, probably working on another project, her fingers flying across the keyboard in that focused way that told me she was creating something amazing. When I knocked on her door to tell her guests were arriving, she looked up with those deep brown eyes that have always held more wisdom than most adults I know. "Mom," she said quietly, "what if they're right? What if I really don't have what it takes?" My heart broke a little because I could hear years of accumulated doubt in her voice. Years of being told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, focused enough. Years of standardized tests that didn't measure her kind of intelligence and college applications that reduced her worth to numbers that couldn't capture her creativity. "Riley," I said, sitting on the edge of her bed, "do you remember when you Built that app to help Mrs. Johnson track her diabetes medication? She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. And do you remember when you designed the website for Dad's auto shop that increased his business by 30%? That was just basic stuff, Mom. Basic? I laughed. Honey, I can barely figure out how to update my Facebook status, and you're creating solutions that actually help people. That's not basic. That's extraordinary. But I could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes, put there by too many people who measured success by traditional standards and couldn't see the revolution happening right in front of them. The party started at 2 o'clock, and by 2:30, the subtle digs had already begun. My sister Janet arrived with her son Kevin, who'd graduated valedictorian and was heading to MIT in the fall. She made sure to mention his full scholarship at least 3 times within the first 10 minutes. My brother Tom brought his daughter Sarah, who'd just finished her freshman year at Stanford with a 4.0 GPA, and somehow managed to work that into every conversation. I watched Riley shrink a little more with each comparison, each casual mention of other kids' achievements that were meant to highlight what she hadn't accomplished. She smiled politely and answered questions about her plans, with vague responses about exploring options and taking some time to figure things out. But I could see the way her shoulders tensed, the way her hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. Marcus, my brother-in-law, had always been the most vocal about his opinions regarding Riley's potential. He's a successful insurance broker who measures everything in terms of profit margins and predictable outcomes. To him, Riley's creative pursuits were hobbies at best, time-wasting at worst. He'd never understood why I encouraged her interests instead of pushing her toward practical career paths. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. So, Riley, he said loudly enough for half the party to hear, have you given any more thought to that community college program I mentioned? The one for kids who need a different kind of support? Riley's face flushed, red, and I felt my protective instincts flare. Riley has plenty of options, Marcus. She's incredibly talented. He gave me that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. Karen, I admire your optimism. I really do. But at some point, we have to be realistic about these things. Not every kid is cut out for traditional success, and that's okay. There are plenty of good jobs that don't require... Don't require what? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Well, you know, advanced education, complex thinking. Some people are better suited for hands-on work, following directions, rather than making the big decisions. The party seemed to pause around us. I felt the familiar fire building in my chest, the same anger that rose every time someone tried to put my daughter in a box labeled limited potential. But before I could respond, Riley surprised everyone by speaking up. Actually, Uncle Marcus, I've been working on something that might interest you. It's a platform that could revolutionize how insurance companies process claims and communicate with clients. I've been developing it for the past 6 months. Marcus looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd forgotten Riley could speak for herself. That's nice, honey. But building real business solutions requires years of education and experience. It's not something you can just figure out on your own. And that's when he said it. The words that would echo in my mind for hours. Afterward, you're setting her up for failure. She'll never make it in the real world. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not because it was shouted or meant to be vicious, but because it was said with such certainty, such matter-of-fact dismissal of everything I knew my daughter to be capable of achieving. Riley's face went pale, and she excused herself to go inside. I watched her walk toward the house, her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to make herself smaller, invisible. My heart broke for the 100th time, watching the world try to convince my brilliant, creative, innovative daughter that she was somehow less than extraordinary. But the worst was yet to come. As the afternoon wore on, the comments became more frequent. more pointed. My cousin Linda wondered aloud if Riley had considered vocational training for something practical. My Uncle Robert suggested that maybe college isn't for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. Each comment felt like another small cut, death by 1,000 paper cuts of lowered expectations. The breaking point came when my own mother, Riley's grandmother, the woman who should have been her biggest cheerleader, pulled me aside near the dessert table. Mom has always been practical to a fault, someone who believes in playing it safe and not reaching too far beyond your predetermined station in life. "Karen," she said in that gentle but firm tone she'd used when I was young and had what she called unrealistic ideas. "I think it's time we had a frank conversation about Riley's future." I felt my stomach clench. "What do you mean, Mom?" "I mean that maybe it's time to accept reality. Some kids just aren't built for success, at least not the kind of success you keep pushing her toward. Riley is a sweet girl, but she's struggled her whole life. The low grades, the learning difficulties, the inability to focus. These aren't things that just go away because we want them to." I stared at my mother, this woman who had raised me to believe I could accomplish anything, and wondered when she'd become someone who put limits on her own granddaughter's potential. "She's different, Mom. That doesn't mean she's broken." "I'm not saying she's broken," Mom replied, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear us. "I'm saying she's not cut out for the competitive world you keep trying to push her into. Maybe it would be kinder to help her find something more manageable, something where she won't constantly feel like she's failing." The word manageable hit me like a slap. As if my daughter's dreams needed to be managed, contained, reduced to something small enough that failure wouldn't hurt so much. "You don't see her, Mom. None of you see her. You see the grades and the test scores and the struggle, but you don't see the solutions she creates, the problems she solves, the way her mind works differently, but brilliantly." My mother's expression softened with pity, which somehow made it worse. "Oh, honey, I know you love her. I know you want to protect her. But sometimes the most loving thing we can do is help someone accept their limitations before the world does it for them." I walked away from that conversation feeling hollowed out, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell. This was supposed to be Riley's day, her moment to feel proud of finishing high school, despite every obstacle that had been thrown in her path. Instead, it had become another opportunity for people to catalog her deficiencies and predict her failure. I found Riley in her room, sitting at her desk with her laptop open. She wasn't crying, which somehow made it worse. She just looked, defeated, resigned, like she'd finally started to believe what everyone had been telling her about herself. "Hey," I said softly, sitting on her bed. "How are you holding up?" She shrugged without looking away from her screen. "I'm fine, just working on some code. It helps me think. What did Uncle Marcus say to you after you mentioned your platform?" Riley's fingers paused over the keyboard. "He said it was cute that I had hobbies, but that I shouldn't confuse playing around with computers with having real business skills. He said the real world doesn't care about participation trophies." The casual cruelty of adults never ceased to amaze me. How easily they could dismiss a young person's passion, reduce their innovation to playing around, their dreams to participation. Trophies. "Riley, look at me." She turned in her chair, and I saw something in her eyes that terrified me. Not sadness or anger, but resignation. The look of someone who was starting to believe that maybe everyone else was right. "Do you remember what you told me last month when you finished that client project? About how coding makes you feel?" A small smile flickered across her face. "I said it makes me feel like I'm speaking the universe's language, like I'm having conversations with possibility itself." "And do you remember what you said about the platform you're building?" "That it could help thousands of people navigate systems that were designed to confuse them. That technology should make life easier, not harder. That doesn't sound like playing around to me. That sounds like someone who sees problems the rest of us don't even know exist and creates solutions that could change everything. Riley was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently typing commands that made lines of code appear and disappear on her screen like digital poetry. But what if they're right, Mom? What if I'm just deluding myself? What if I really don't have what it takes to make it in the real world? I wanted to wrap her in my arms and shield her from every doubt, every cruel comment, every person who couldn't see her brilliance. But I also knew that she needed to find her own strength, her own reason to believe in herself that didn't depend on my protection. Riley, do you know what the difference is between you and everyone downstairs? She shook her head. They see the world as it is and accept it. You see the world as it could be and work to make it better. That's not a limitation. That's a superpower. Before she could respond, we heard a car pulling into the driveway. Riley looked out her window and frowned. That's weird. I don't recognize that car. I looked out and saw a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. Definitely not the kind of car any of our family or friends drove. A man in a business suit got out, carrying what looked like an official envelope. Are you expecting someone? Riley asked. I shook my head, feeling a flutter of curiosity mixed with apprehension. Let's go see what this is about. We made our way downstairs and outside, where the man in the suit was asking for Riley by name. The party had quieted, everyone curious about this unexpected visitor who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Riley Morrison? The man asked politely. That's me, Riley said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have a delivery for you from Innovate Tech Solutions. CEO David Chen asked me to deliver this personally. He handed Riley a thick envelope with the company's logo embossed in gold. I recognized the name immediately. Innovate Tech Solutions was one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the state, known for their cutting-edge software and innovative approach to business solutions. Riley stared at the envelope like it might explode. I don't understand. Why would they send me anything? The delivery man smiled. I believe that explanation is inside. Congratulations, Miss Morrison. He walked back to his car, leaving Riley standing in the middle of our backyard, surrounded by family members who had spent the afternoon questioning her potential, holding an envelope that might just change everything. Marcus was the first to speak. What could they possibly want with you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with all the doubt and dismissal that had characterized the entire afternoon. Riley looked at the envelope, then at me, then at the faces of everyone who had spent the day telling her she wasn't good enough. And in that moment, I saw something shift in her expression. The resignation was gone, replaced by something that looked like determination mixed with hope. Well, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day, I guess there's only one way to find out. When I think back to Riley's childhood, I remember a little girl who saw the world as one giant puzzle waiting to be solved. While other kids played with dolls or toy cars, Riley was taking apart old electronics I'd given up for dead, spreading tiny components across our kitchen table like a surgeon preparing for operation. She was 7 when she fixed our ancient laptop that 3 different repair shops had declared beyond salvation. She was 9 when she created her first website, a digital journal about rescued animals that somehow got featured on our local news station. But none of that seemed to matter when parent-teacher conferences rolled around. Every semester brought the same script of concern. Mrs. Henderson in 3rd grade. Riley is clearly intelligent, but she has trouble staying on task. Mr. Peterson in 5th grade. She sees solutions that aren't in the textbook, which can be problematic for standardized assessments. Ms. Garcia in 7th grade. Her mind works differently, and while that's not necessarily bad, it does make traditional academic success challenging. I started to see a pattern that broke my heart. Riley would come home excited about a project or an idea, her eyes bright with possibility, and I'd watch that light dim a little more each time someone told her she was thinking about things the wrong way. By high school, she'd learned to keep her innovations to herself, sharing her creations only with me and a small circle of online friends who appreciated her unique approach to problem solving. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family members questioning her potential at the graduation party were the ones who'd benefited from her talents over the years. My father's small accounting firm still used the database system Riley had built for him when she was 15, a project that had streamlined his client management so effectively that his productivity increased by 40%. My sister Janet's bakery had been struggling until Riley designed a custom ordering app that turned her weekend side business into a thriving enterprise with a 2-month waiting list for special occasions. But somehow, none of these real-world successes translated into respect for Riley's abilities. They were dismissed as lucky accidents, beginner's luck, or simple tasks that anyone could accomplish with enough time and patience. It was as if my family had collectively decided that because Riley struggled with traditional academic markers, her innovative solutions couldn't possibly be as valuable as they appeared. The morning after the graduation party, I woke up thinking about that envelope. Riley had held it for nearly 10 minutes before carefully placing it on her desk, telling everyone she wanted to process privately before opening it. I respected her need for space, but the curiosity was eating me alive. Innovate Tech Solutions wasn't just any company. They were the kind of organization that recruited exclusively from top-tier universities, the kind of place where starting salaries exceeded what most people made after decades in their careers. I found Riley in the kitchen, already dressed and sipping coffee with an intensity that told me she hadn't slept much. The envelope sat on the counter beside her, still unopened, somehow managing to look both innocent and earth-shattering at the same time. "Morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" She looked up with eyes that held a mixture of excitement and terror. "Mom, what if it's just a form letter? What if it's some kind of mistake? What if they meant to send it to someone else with the same name?" I sat down across from her, studying her face. This was the same expression she'd worn before every major test, every college application deadline, every moment when she'd had to put herself out there despite knowing the odds were stacked against her. "Riley, when have you ever known the universe to send you something by accident?" She almost smiled at that. We'd developed this philosophy over the years, born from watching too many of her impossible projects succeed against all logical expectations. Riley didn't just stumble into opportunities. She created them through sheer determination and innovative thinking. I keep thinking about what Uncle Marcus said yesterday, about setting myself up for failure. What if he's right? What if I've been fooling myself about my abilities? The vulnerability in her voice nearly broke me. Here was a young woman who had taught herself advanced programming languages, who had created solutions that professional developers struggled with, who had turned abstract problems into elegant code that actually improved people's lives, and she was doubting herself because people who couldn't even update their own social media profiles had questioned her potential. "Riley, do you remember the story I told you about your grandmother, my mom, when she was young?" Riley nodded. "It was one of our family legends, though one that seemed to get forgotten when convenient. She wanted to be a nurse, but her father told her it was too demanding, too competitive, that girls from families like ours should aim for more realistic goals like secretarial work or teaching elementary school. She listened to him and spent 40 years working as a receptionist, always wondering what might have been different if she'd trusted her own instincts instead of other people's limitations. But she ended up happy, didn't she?" "She ended up safe," I corrected gently. "There's a difference. And I think that's why she's so focused on protecting you from disappointment. She doesn't want you to experience the regret she carried for decades. But what she doesn't understand is that the biggest regret isn't trying and failing. It's never trying at all. Riley was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug in slow circles on the table. Finally, she looked up with an expression I recognized, the same focused determination she got when she was about to tackle a particularly challenging piece of code. Will you stay with me while I open it? I wouldn't be anywhere else. She picked up the envelope with steady hands, though I could see the slight tremor in her fingers as she carefully opened the flap. Inside was a thick packet of papers, the first page bearing the official letterhead of Innovate Tech Solutions. Riley read silently for several minutes, her expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something that looked like disbelief. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I think you need to read this." She handed me the letter, and I began reading words that would change everything we thought we knew about my daughter's future. Dear Ms. Morrison, we are writing to follow up on the software solution you submitted to our Innovation Challenge 6 months ago. After extensive review and testing by our development team, we are pleased to inform you that your insurance claims processing platform has been selected as the winner of our annual competition. Your solution demonstrated not only technical excellence, but also an intuitive understanding of user experience that impressed our entire evaluation committee. I stopped reading and looked at Riley, who was staring at me with wide eyes. You entered a competition? When? Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think I'd win. I barely thought I'd qualify. It was just something I found online, and the problem they described was exactly what I'd been working on anyway. I figured it couldn't hurt to submit it, but I never expected. I continued reading. Your platform's ability to streamline communication between insurance providers, healthcare facilities, and patients while maintaining security protocols and reducing processing time by an average of 67% represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking our industry needs. We would like to offer you a position as junior software developer with our team, beginning immediately upon your acceptance. The letter went on to detail a starting salary that was more than I made as a dental hygienist with 20 years of experience, comprehensive benefits, and opportunities for rapid advancement based on performance. But more than the financial aspects, what struck me was the tone of genuine respect and excitement about Riley's potential contributions. There's more, Riley said quietly, pulling out additional documents. They want me to present my platform to their board of directors next month. They're talking about potentially licensing it to major insurance companies nationwide. And look at this. She handed me another page, this one containing testimonials from beta testers who had used Riley's system. Healthcare administrators, describing how her solution had eliminated hours of paperwork from their daily routines. Insurance agents explaining how the streamlined communication had improved their client satisfaction ratings. Patients expressing gratitude for technology that made navigating medical claims feel less like solving a puzzle designed to defeat them. Riley, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Do you understand what this means? You've created something. That doesn't just work, it helps people. Real people dealing with real problems. She nodded slowly, as if she was still processing the reality of what we were reading. The crazy part is, I never thought of it as revolutionary. I just got frustrated watching you deal with insurance hassles after your surgery last year, and I kept thinking there had to be a better way, so I built one. That was so perfectly Riley, seeing a problem that affected someone she loved and refusing to accept that it was just how things work. While other people complained about broken systems, she wrote code to fix them. The rest of the morning was a blur of phone calls and research. Riley wanted to understand everything about Innovate Tech Solutions before making any decisions. She spent hours reading about the company's culture, their other products, their commitment to innovation and employee development. I watched her transform from the uncertain young woman who doubted herself at the graduation party to someone who was beginning to recognize her own power. But I also knew that accepting this opportunity would mean facing all the people who had counted her out, who had predicted her failure with such certainty. The thought of seeing Marcus's expression when he learned about the job offer filled me with a satisfaction I probably shouldn't have enjoyed as much as I did. That afternoon, Riley made 2 phone calls. The first was to Innovate Tech Solutions, accepting their offer and scheduling her presentation for the following month. The second was to her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, who had spent 4 years suggesting more realistic career paths and steering Riley away from competitive programs. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Riley Morrison. I wanted to let you know that I won't be needing those community college brochures after all. I've accepted a position as a software developer with Innovate Tech Solutions, and they're interested in licensing my insurance platform nationally." Yes, that Riley Morrison. The one with the 2.3 GPA who you said wasn't college material. I had to admire Riley's grace. She delivered the news without malice, simply sharing information that redefined everything Mrs. Patterson thought she knew about potential and success. When she hung up, Riley looked at me with a grin that could have powered our entire neighborhood. She asked if I was sure I wanted to turn down safer options for something so risky. I told her that the riskiest thing I could do would be to ignore my own abilities to make other people more comfortable. That evening, word began to spread. Through our extended family network, my sister Janet called first, having heard from our cousin Linda, who had somehow learned about the job offer through the hometown gossip chain that rivaled any social media algorithm for speed and reach. "Karen, is it true that Riley got some kind of tech job?" "It's true. She's been hired as a software developer, and they're considering licensing her platform nationally." There was a long pause. "But she just graduated high school. How is that possible?" "She's been developing software for years, Janet. Remember the app she built for your bakery? That wasn't beginner's luck. That was skill. We all thought. How were we supposed to know she was actually good at this stuff?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. How were they supposed to know? Perhaps by paying attention when she talked about her projects? Perhaps by asking questions about her interests instead of dismissing them as hobbies. Perhaps by recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms, and academic grades don't always reflect real-world capability. "Maybe by listening to her," I said gently. "She's been trying to show you who she is for years." The next call came from my mother, her voice tight with something between surprise and defensiveness. "Karen, I heard about Riley's job. That's wonderful, of course, but I hope you're not letting this go to her head. One opportunity doesn't guarantee long-term success." I felt the familiar frustration rise in my chest. Even faced with evidence of Riley's capabilities, my mother was still focused on managing expectations rather than celebrating achievements. "Mom, she won a national competition. They're talking about licensing her work to major corporations. At 18, she's created something that could help thousands of people navigate healthcare systems more easily. How is that not worth celebrating?" "I'm just saying that the tech industry is notoriously unstable. People get laid off all the time. It might be wise to have backup plans." "You know what, Mom? For once in her life, Riley doesn't need a backup plan. She needs people who believe in her first plan." The conversation with Marcus was the one I'd been both dreading and anticipating. He called that evening, his voice careful and measured in a way that suggested he was still processing the news. "Karen, I owe you an apology, and I owe Riley a bigger one." I waited, not making it easy for him. I clearly underestimated her abilities. I had no idea she was working on legitimate business solutions. When you said she was talented with computers, I thought you meant she was good at social media or online games. I didn't realize she was creating actual software. That's exactly the problem, Marcus. You made assumptions based on her age and her grades instead of looking at what she was actually accomplishing. Riley has been showing you who she is for years. You just weren't paying attention. How was I supposed to know? She never talked about this stuff at family gatherings. She stopped talking about it because people like you made it clear that her interests weren't valuable or worth discussing. You taught her that her passion was something to be ashamed of, instead of something to be proud of. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What can I do to make this right? Start by recognizing that there are different kinds of intelligence and different paths to success. Stop measuring kids against narrow definitions of achievement. And maybe, next time someone's passionate about something you don't understand, ask them to teach you about it instead of dismissing it. That night, I found Riley in her room, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, already deep into research about her new role. She looked up when I knocked, her face glowing with an excitement I hadn't seen since she was little. "Mom, look at this. They have a mentorship program where senior developers work with new hires to help them grow their skills, and they encourage employees to spend 20% of their time on personal projects that could become new products. It's like they actually want people to innovate instead of just following instructions." I sat on her bed, watching my daughter plan her future with the confidence of someone who finally understood her own worth. "Are you nervous about starting?" "Terrified," she admitted with a laugh. "But it's a good kind of terrified, like standing at the edge of a diving board, knowing the water's going to be cold, but also knowing you're about to fly. You know what I'm proudest of?" She looked up from her computer. "Not the job, though that's incredible. I'm proudest that you never let them convince you to be smaller than you are. Every time someone told you to lower your expectations or aim for something more realistic, you kept building, kept creating, kept believing in possibilities they couldn't see." Riley was quiet for a moment, then said something that will stay with me forever. "I think I finally understand the difference between confidence and arrogance. Confidence is knowing what you're capable of and working to achieve it. Arrogance is thinking you're better than other people. I spent so long being afraid of seeming arrogant that I forgot how to be confident." As I turned off her light and headed to my own room, I realized that the envelope from Innovate Tech Solutions hadn't just delivered a job offer. It had delivered validation that my daughter's unique way of seeing the world wasn't a limitation to be managed, but a strength to be celebrated. Tomorrow, we would start planning for Riley's new chapter. But tonight, I went to sleep knowing that every time I'd told her she was capable of extraordinary things, every time I'd encouraged her to trust her own instincts, every time I'd refused to let her shrink her dreams to fit other people's expectations, I had been preparing her for exactly this moment. The girl they said had no future was about to show them what the future actually looked like. The weeks leading up to Riley's board presentation became a masterclass in preparation and perseverance. I watched my daughter transform from someone who doubted her own abilities into a young professional who understood the weight of her innovation. Every morning, she'd wake up at 6 to review technical documentation, practice her presentation, and refine her platform based on feedback from the Innovate Tech Solutions development team. What struck me most was how naturally she stepped into this new role. While other 18-year-olds were debating college majors or planning gap years, Riley was collaborating with seasoned engineers, participating in strategy meetings, and contributing ideas that were being implemented by a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She didn't seem overwhelmed by the responsibility. If anything, she seemed energized by finally being in an environment where her unique perspective was valued rather than corrected. 3 weeks before the presentation, Riley received an email that would add another layer to her already compelling story. The message was from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the Director of Women in Technology Initiative at Stanford University. Somehow, word of Riley's innovation and unconventional path had reached academic circles that typically focused on traditional high achievers. "Riley," Dr. Rodriguez wrote, "I've been following your work with Innovate Tech Solutions, and I'm impressed not only by your technical skills, but by your approach to problem solving. We have a program here at Stanford that focuses on entrepreneurial innovation rather than traditional academic metrics. I'd love to discuss how someone with your mindset might contribute to our research initiatives, even without following the conventional undergraduate route. Riley stared at the email for a long time before showing it to me. "Mom, Stanford is reaching out to me." Stanford, the same school that rejected my application 6 months ago. The irony was breathtaking. Here was one of the most prestigious universities in the country, suddenly interested in the same young woman they'd dismissed based on test scores and GPA. It was a perfect example of how narrow admission criteria could blind institutions to exactly the kind of innovative thinking they claimed to value. "What are you going to do?" Riley considered this for several days before responding to Dr. Rodriguez. Her reply was gracious but firm. "Thank you for your interest in my work. Right now I'm focused on my role at Innovate Tech Solutions and the opportunity to implement solutions that can help people immediately. Perhaps we can revisit this conversation in a few years, when I've gained more real-world experience and can contribute even more meaningfully to your research initiatives." I was proud of her response. She wasn't closing doors, but she was making it clear that she valued practical impact over prestigious credentials. The girl who had been told she wasn't college material was now turning down overtures from Stanford because she had found something better, a place where her work mattered immediately. The presentation date was set for the first Thursday in August. Riley would have 30 minutes to demonstrate her platform to a board that included the CEO, CTO, and several venture capital partners who were considering major investments in Innovate Tech Solutions. No pressure whatsoever. But as the date approached, I noticed something interesting happening in our community. Word had spread about Riley's success, and suddenly, other young people started reaching out. First, it was Alex Chen, a senior at Riley's high school who had always struggled with traditional math, but had an intuitive understanding of coding patterns. Then came Maria Santos, a recent graduate who had been discouraged from pursuing engineering because of her anxiety around standardized tests. One by one, kids who had been told they weren't cut out for competitive fields started asking Riley for advice about following unconventional paths. Riley started holding informal mentoring sessions in our garage, which she had converted into a makeshift tech lab years earlier. Every Saturday morning, a small group of teenagers would gather around her multiple monitors, learning not just about programming but about persistence, about believing in their own abilities even when others couldn't see their potential. "The thing is," Riley told them during one of these sessions, "everyone's looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs, but they want them to look exactly like the last Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs. They want innovation, but only from people who fit their idea of what innovators should look like." She pulled up her insurance platform, showing them the clean interface that made complex processes feel intuitive. "This exists because I got frustrated watching my mom deal with medical billing after her surgery. I wasn't trying to change the world. I was just trying to solve a problem that affected someone I love. But it turns out that when you solve problems that affect real people, you end up changing more than you expected." Maria raised her hand. "But how did you know you were good enough to submit it to a competition?" "I didn't," Riley answered honestly. "I submitted it because I figured the worst thing that could happen was they'd say no, and I was already used to people saying no. But I realized that I'd rather fail at something I'm passionate about than succeed at something that bores me." These Saturday sessions became legendary in our neighborhood. Parents started dropping off kids who had been struggling in traditional academic settings, but showed signs of creative problem-solving. Riley never charged for these sessions. She said she was paying forward all the encouragement I'd given her over the years. One particularly memorable session involved Tommy Williams, a 15-year-old with severe ADHD who couldn't sit still in traditional classrooms, but could focus for hours when working on projects that interested him. His parents had been told repeatedly that he needed to learn to control himself before he could be successful in any field. Riley watched Tommy for about 10 minutes, then handed him a simple programming challenge. "Tommy, I need you to help me build a tool that reminds people to take medication on time. My grandmother keeps forgetting her blood pressure pills, And I think we could create something that would help her and other people like her. For the next 3 hours, Tommy worked with intense focus, asking thoughtful questions and contributing ideas that hadn't occurred to Riley. By the end of the session, they had created a prototype for a medication reminder app that was more user-friendly than anything currently available. "Tommy," Riley said as they wrapped up, "your brain isn't broken. It's just designed for problems that haven't been invented yet. The world needs people who think differently, because the people who think the same way as everyone else can only solve the problems everyone else has already figured out." Tommy's mother cried when she picked him up that day. "I've never seen him focus like that. 3 different doctors have told me he'll never be able to handle academic pressure, but he just spent 3 hours doing what looks like graduate-level work." "That's because he wasn't being asked to memorize information," Riley explained. "He was being asked to create solutions. There's a huge difference." These interactions were shaping Riley into more than just a talented developer. She was becoming an advocate for different kinds of intelligence, different paths to success. She started writing blog posts about her experience, sharing her story with online communities focused on alternative education and neurodiversity. Her posts went viral in circles of parents, educators, and students who were tired of one-size-fits-all approaches to learning and achievement. One post particularly resonated with readers. "I spent 12 years in a system that measured my worth by how well I could memorize information and regurgitate it under time pressure. I was labeled as struggling because I processed information differently, because I saw connections that weren't in the textbook, because I asked questions that weren't on the test. But the real world doesn't care about your ability to memorize the periodic table. It cares about your ability to solve problems that actually matter." The response was overwhelming. Educators reached out asking her to speak at conferences. Parents shared their own children's stories of struggling in traditional settings while excelling in creative or technical pursuits. Most importantly, young people who had been told they weren't smart enough or focused enough or conventional enough began to see new possibilities for their futures. 2 weeks before the board presentation, Riley received a call that would add yet another dimension to her story. The caller identified herself as Jennifer Liu, a producer for a nationally syndicated morning show that focused on inspiring stories of young entrepreneurs and innovators. "Riley, we'd love to feature your story on our program. What you've accomplished challenges a lot of assumptions about traditional paths to success, and we think our audience would be inspired by your journey." Riley was hesitant at first. "I don't want this to be about me being special or different. I want it to be about the fact that there are thousands of kids like me who just need people to pay attention to what they're actually capable of instead of what they're supposed to be capable of." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly why we want to tell your story. You're right. You're not unique in having abilities that don't show up on traditional measures. But you are unique in having a mother who believed in you and your own determination to keep creating despite people telling you to aim lower. That combination could inspire other families to look for different kinds of potential." Riley agreed to the interview, with one condition. She wanted to include some of the young people from her mentoring sessions to show that innovation comes from unexpected places when people are given the right kind of support. The television crew arrived on a Saturday morning when Riley's garage was full of teenagers working on various projects. Tommy was refining his medication reminder app. Maria was designing a study app for students with test anxiety. Alex was creating a tool that would help non-native English speakers navigate government websites more easily. The producer, Jennifer, looked around the garage with obvious amazement. "This looks like a startup incubator." "That's exactly what it is," Riley replied. "Except instead of funding, we're providing something more valuable. The belief that these kids can solve problems that matter." The segment that aired 2 weeks later was more powerful than any of us had expected. It opened with Riley at her computer, lines of code flowing across multiple screens, then cut to testimonials from the teenagers whose lives had been changed by her mentoring. Tommy's mother spoke about watching her hyperactive son discover his ability to focus when working on meaningful projects. Maria's father talked about seeing his daughter's confidence bloom as she learned that her anxiety wasn't a limitation, but a different way of processing challenges. But the most impactful moment came when Riley spoke directly to the camera. "I want every kid who's been told they're not smart enough, not focused enough, not traditional enough, to know that the world needs exactly what you have to offer. The problems that matter most can't be solved by people who all think the same way. They need the kids who see things differently, who ask uncomfortable questions, who refuse to accept that this is just how things work." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Riley's inbox flooded with messages from young people who had seen the segment and were inspired to pursue their own unconventional paths. Parents reached out asking for advice about supporting children who didn't fit traditional molds. Educators requested resources for identifying and nurturing different kinds of intelligence. More importantly, several tech companies contacted Riley about internship and mentoring opportunities for the young people in her program. Tommy was offered a summer position with a health tech startup that was impressed by his medication reminder app. Maria received a scholarship to a coding bootcamp that specialized in creating educational technology. Alex was invited to collaborate with a nonprofit that focused on making government services more accessible to immigrant communities. "You see what's happening here?" I asked Riley one evening as we sorted through the pile of opportunities and requests that had resulted from her television appearance. "What do you mean?" "You're not just changing your own life. You're changing the conversation about what success looks like, what intelligence means, what paths are possible. Every kid you mentor, every story you share, every assumption you challenge, it all ripples outward." Riley looked thoughtful. "I keep thinking about something Tommy said last week. He told me that before he started coming here, he thought his brain was broken. Now he says his brain is just designed for problems that haven't been invented yet. What if there are thousands of kids out there who think they're broken when they're actually exactly what the world needs?" The night before her board presentation, Riley couldn't sleep. I found her in the kitchen at 2 a.m, reviewing her slides one final time. "Nervous?" "Excited," she corrected. "I keep thinking about everyone who said I'd never make it in the real world. Tomorrow, I get to show them what the real world actually looks like." She turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a slide that featured photos from her mentoring sessions alongside metrics about her platform's impact. "I'm not just presenting software tomorrow. I'm presenting a different way of thinking about potential. Are you ready?" Riley closed her laptop and looked at me with eyes that held the same determination I'd seen when she was 7 years old, taking apart electronics to understand how they worked. "Mom, I've been ready for this my whole life. I just didn't know it yet." As we headed upstairs to try to get some sleep before the biggest day of her young career, I realized that the scared, uncertain young woman who had doubted herself at the graduation party had been replaced by someone who understood her own power. Tomorrow she would walk into that boardroom not as someone asking for approval, but as someone offering solutions the world needed. The girl they said had no future was about to show them what the future actually looked like. And more importantly, she was going to make sure other kids like her had the chance to show the world what they could accomplish when someone believed in their potential. The morning of Riley's board presentation dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that feels like the universe is aligning in your favor. She was up before her alarm, already dressed in the navy blazer we'd chosen together. Professional, but not trying too hard. Confident, but not arrogant. I found her in the kitchen, not nervously reviewing notes, but doing something that made my heart swell with pride. She was video calling Tommy to help him debug a feature in his medication app. "Try running that function again," she told him, her voice calm and focused. "Remember, we talked about this. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that seem too simple to work." After she hung up, Riley looked at me with a serenity I hadn't expected. "You know what I realized last night? This presentation isn't about proving myself to them. It's about showing them what's possible when you stop limiting people based on how they look on paper. We arrived at the Innovate Tech Solutions headquarters 45 minutes early. The building was everything you'd expect from a cutting-edge tech company. Glass and steel reaching toward the sky, interactive displays in the lobby showcasing their latest innovations, employees moving through open collaborative spaces with the kind of energy that comes from working on problems that matter. David Chen, the CEO, met us in the lobby personally. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of presence that suggested he was someone who got things done without needing to prove how important he was. "Riley," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth, "I can't tell you how excited we are about today. Your platform has already changed how our beta testers think about user experience design. We're hoping today's presentation will help us understand how to scale that impact." As we rode the elevator to the executive conference room, David shared something that gave me chills. "You know, Riley, in 20 years of running tech companies, I've seen thousands of presentations from people with advanced degrees, decades of experience, prestigious credentials. But I've never seen anything that solved real problems as elegantly as what you created in your bedroom." The boardroom was exactly what you'd picture when you think of high-stakes corporate decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a massive conference table that could seat 20 people, wall-mounted screens ready to display whatever data would determine the future of billion-dollar investments. 7 people were already seated: the CTO, 2 VPs of development, 3 venture capital partners, and the director of strategic initiatives. Riley set up her laptop with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times instead of never. She connected to the presentation system, tested her audio levels, and arranged her notes with the kind of methodical preparation that told me she was channeling her nervous energy into focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, "meet Riley Morrison, the 18-year-old developer whose insurance platform won our Innovation Challenge and has the potential to revolutionize how people interact with healthcare systems. Riley, the floor is yours." What happened next was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Riley didn't start with technical specifications or market analysis or any of the corporate presentation formats these executives were used to. Instead, she began with a story. 6 months ago, my mom had surgery to repair a torn rotator cuff. Simple procedure, but the insurance paperwork turned it into a nightmare that lasted weeks. Every day, she'd spend hours on the phone, getting transferred between departments, trying to understand why claims were being denied, what additional documentation was needed, why the same information had to be submitted multiple times to different systems. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a flowchart of the typical insurance claim process. A maze of interconnected boxes, arrows pointing in every direction, dead ends and loops that seemed designed to frustrate rather than help. I watched someone I love struggle with a system that seemed designed to defeat her, and I kept thinking, this isn't just inefficient, it's cruel. We have the technology to make this easier, but we're using it to create barriers instead of removing them. The room was completely silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. This wasn't what they'd expected from a teenage presenter. Riley clicked to the next slide, showing her platform's interface. Clean, intuitive, with visual indicators that made complex processes feel manageable. So, I built something different. Not just a new system, but a new way of thinking about how technology should serve people instead of the other way around. For the next 20 minutes, Riley demonstrated her platform with the expertise of someone who understood every line of code because she had written it herself. She showed how patients could track claim status in real time, how healthcare providers could submit documentation through streamlined interfaces, how insurance companies could process claims faster while maintaining security protocols. But more than the technical capabilities, what impressed the room was Riley's understanding of user psychology. She had anticipated every point of confusion, every moment where someone might feel overwhelmed, and designed solutions that felt like having a knowledgeable friend guiding you through an otherwise frustrating process. The average insurance claim currently requires 47 minutes of phone time and 23 separate pieces of documentation, Riley explained, pulling up data from her beta testing. Our platform reduces that to 12 minutes and 8 documents, while increasing successful claim resolution by 73%. One of the venture capital partners, a woman named Sarah Goldman, raised her hand. Riley, these are impressive metrics, but I have to ask, how do you know this will scale beyond your test group? Enterprise software often looks great in small implementations but falls apart when you're dealing with millions of users. Riley smiled, and I could see she'd been hoping for exactly this question. That's actually the beauty of this approach. Because the platform is designed around human psychology rather than corporate convenience, it becomes more effective as it scales. Every user interaction generates data that helps the system become more intuitive for the next user. She pulled up a real-time dashboard showing usage patterns from the beta test. Look at this heat map. See how users naturally navigate toward the most efficient paths? The system learns from that behavior and optimizes the interface accordingly. It's not just software, it's artificial intelligence that gets smarter by helping people. The CTO, a man named Michael Park, leaned back in his chair with an expression of obvious admiration. Riley, I have to be honest, I was skeptical. When David told me we were licensing technology from someone who just graduated high school. But what you've created here demonstrates a level of systems thinking that most developers take years to develop. How did you learn to approach problems? This way? Riley considered the question carefully. I think it's because I've spent my whole life having to find workarounds for systems that weren't designed for people like me. When you have dyslexia and ADHD, you get really good at figuring out alternative paths to the same destination. You learn to design solutions that account for different ways of processing information. She paused, then added something that made my heart swell with pride. But I also think it's because my mom taught me that the most important question isn't, how do we make this work for us? But how do we make this work for everyone? When you design for the people who struggle the most, you end up creating something that's better for everyone. Sarah Goldman was taking notes furiously. Talk to me about scalability from a business perspective. What's your vision for implementation across major insurance networks? Riley clicked to a slide that showed partnership projections and rollout timelines. Phase 1 would involve partnering with 3 major insurers to implement the platform. For their individual policyholders, approximately 3 million users. Based on our beta testing, we project a 45% reduction in customer service costs and a 60% increase in customer satisfaction scores within the first year. She continued outlining phases 2 and 3, which involved expanding to employer-sponsored plans and eventually creating a universal interface that would work across all insurance providers. Her projections were conservative but compelling, backed by data from comparable software implementations and user behavior studies. But what impressed me most wasn't the business acumen. It was watching my daughter hold her own in a room, full of people with decades more experience, presenting ideas that could affect millions of lives, speaking with the authority of someone who understood both the technical challenges and the human impact of her work. David Chen asked the final question. Riley, if we move forward with full implementation, this platform could be processing billions of dollars in claims within 2 years. That's a massive responsibility. How do you feel about having that kind of impact? Riley was quiet for a moment, and I could see her thinking carefully about her response. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything she'd learned about herself over the past months. A year ago, I thought success meant convincing people that I was smart enough to deserve their respect. But I've learned that real success means using whatever abilities you have to solve problems that actually matter. This platform exists because I couldn't stand watching my mom struggle with a broken system. If it helps millions of other people avoid that frustration, that's not just success, that's purpose. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite corporate clapping I'd expected. These were people who recognized genuine innovation when they saw it, who understood that they were witnessing something special. After Riley finished packing up her materials, David walked us toward the elevator. Riley, I want you to know that in 30 years of business, I've rarely seen a presentation that so perfectly combined technical expertise with human understanding. We're not just licensing your platform. We're partnering with someone who represents the future of technology development. As we waited for the elevator, Sarah Goldman approached us. Riley, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you given any thought to starting your own company? Because what you've created here could be the foundation for something much bigger than a single platform. Riley looked at me, then back at Sarah. Actually, I have been thinking about that, but not in the way you might expect. I want to create a company that develops technology specifically for underserved populations, systems that work for people with disabilities, interfaces designed for non-native English speakers, tools that help bridge digital divides instead of widening them. Sarah's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of vision that changes industries. Would you be interested in discussing funding for that kind of initiative? On the drive home, Riley was unusually quiet. I could see her processing everything that had happened, integrating the feedback and opportunities into her understanding of what came next. So, I finally asked, how does it feel to know that some of the smartest business people in the country think you're onto something revolutionary? Riley smiled, but it wasn't the triumphant expression I'd expected. It was something deeper, more thoughtful. It feels like the beginning instead of the end. Like today wasn't about proving I belong in that room. It was about understanding what I can do now that I'm there. She turned to look out the window at the city passing by. You know what's funny? For years, I thought the goal was to become someone different, someone who fit better into other people's expectations. But today, I realized that the goal was always to become more myself. The world doesn't need another person who thinks like everyone else. It needs people who think like me, like Tommy, like Maria, like all the kids who've been told they're not enough. That evening, Riley's phone started ringing with calls from news outlets that had somehow learned about her presentation. Tech, blogs wanted interviews. Education publications wanted to feature her story. Student organizations requested speaking engagements. But the call that mattered most came from Mrs. Patterson, her old guidance counselor. Riley, I owe you an enormous apology. I heard about your success with Innovate Tech Solutions, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about how I evaluate student potential. Would you be willing to come speak to this year's seniors about alternative paths to success? I think they need to hear from someone who didn't let other people's limitations define their possibilities. Riley agreed, on one condition. She wanted to bring Tommy, Maria, and Alex with her to show that she wasn't an anomaly, but part of a movement of young people who were redefining what success could look like. A month later, I sat in the back of Lincoln High School's auditorium, watching my daughter address an audience of students, parents, and educators. But she wasn't alone on that stage. Tommy was there, demonstrating the medication reminder app that 3 healthcare companies were now interested in licensing. Maria showed the study platform she'd designed for students with test anxiety, which had already been downloaded by thousands of users. Alex presented his government navigation tool, which was being considered for implementation by several municipal offices. A year ago, Riley told the audience, I was sitting in seats just like yours, convinced that my 2.3 GPA meant I wasn't smart enough for the future I wanted. But I learned something that changed everything. There's no such thing as being smart, enough or not smart enough. There's only finding the problems you're meant to solve and refusing to let anyone convince you that you're not capable of solving them. She gestured toward her fellow panelists. Each of us was told at some point that we weren't traditional enough, focused enough, academic enough to succeed in competitive fields. But the problems that matter most can't be solved by traditional thinking. They need people who see the world differently, who ask questions others haven't thought to ask, who refuse to accept that this is just how things work. A student in the front row raised her hand. But what if you're wrong? What if you try something big and fail? Riley smiled, and I saw in her expression all the confidence she'd built over the months of proving herself. Then you'll have learned something valuable about what doesn't work, and you'll be that much closer to finding what does. But if you don't try at all, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been possible. As I watched the faces in that auditorium, students leaning forward with new hope, parents reconsidering their assumptions about their children's potential, educators questioning their traditional metrics of success, I realized that Riley had accomplished something far more important than building successful software. She had proven that the most powerful force in the world isn't technology or money or credentials. It's the refusal to let other people's limitations become your reality. It's the courage to believe in your own potential even when nobody else can see it yet. The girl they said had no future hadn't just created her own future. She had expanded the definition of what futures were possible. And in doing so, she had given thousands of other young people permission to dream bigger than the boxes others had tried to put them in. That night, as I watched Riley work on her next project, a platform designed to help neurodivergent students navigate college applications, I realized that this story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Because the most revolutionary thing about my daughter wasn't the software she'd created or the recognition she'd received. It was her absolute conviction that the world needed exactly what she had to offer, exactly as she was. And now, thanks to her courage to prove the doubters wrong, thousands of other young people were discovering that same revolutionary truth about themselves. The future belonged to the kids who refused to be limited by other people's imagination. And my daughter was leading the way. 6 months after Riley's board presentation, I found myself standing in the lobby of the United Nations headquarters in New York City, watching my daughter prepare to address a global summit on digital inclusion. The journey from that devastating graduation party to this moment felt like something out of a dream, except it was all very real, documented by the badges hanging around our necks and the simultaneous translation devices being distributed to delegates from 47 countries. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered not by a mysterious courier this time, but through a phone call from Dr. Amara Okafor, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Digital Rights. Riley's platform had caught the attention of international development organizations who were struggling to create accessible digital infrastructure in underserved communities worldwide. Ms. Morrison, Dr. Okafor had explained, your approach to user-centered design has applications far beyond insurance claims. We're dealing with billions of people who are excluded from digital systems because those systems weren't designed with their needs in mind. We believe your methodology could help us bridge some of the world's most persistent digital divides. What struck me about this opportunity wasn't just its scope, but how naturally Riley had evolved into someone who thought about problems on a global scale. The young woman who had once doubted whether she belonged in a family gathering was now being asked to help solve challenges that affected entire continents. The weeks leading up to the UN presentation had been a whirlwind of preparation and growth. Riley had spent countless hours researching digital accessibility challenges in developing nations, studying how cultural differences affected technology adoption, learning about infrastructure limitations that made her elegant solutions irrelevant in communities without reliable internet access. But instead of being overwhelmed by the complexity, Riley approached each challenge with the same methodical creativity that had made her insurance platform so successful. She reached out to organizations working on digital inclusion, interviewed people who had been excluded from technological advances, and began developing frameworks that could adapt to vastly different contexts and needs. The thing is, Mom, she had explained one evening as we reviewed her presentation materials, The same principles apply whether you're helping someone navigate insurance claims in Connecticut or helping a farmer in Kenya access market information on a basic smartphone. You have to start with understanding how people actually think and work, not how you wish they thought and worked. The platform she would present to the UN wasn't just an adaptation of her insurance software. It was a complete reimagining of how technology could serve humanity's most vulnerable populations. She had developed modular systems that could function on low-bandwidth connections, interfaces that worked across different literacy levels, and design principles that could be customized for various cultural contexts while maintaining core functionality. What made me proudest wasn't the technical innovation, though that was impressive enough. It was watching Riley understand that with great capability comes great responsibility. She could have easily focused on profitable applications for her skills, but instead, she was choosing to tackle problems that affected people who had no voice in technological development. The morning of her UN presentation, Riley woke up with an energy I hadn't seen since her first day at Innovate Tech Solutions. She wasn't nervous. She was excited about the possibility of scaling her impact beyond anything she had previously imagined. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said over breakfast in our Manhattan hotel room. "Remember when Uncle Marcus said I'd never make it in the real world?" He was measuring success by how well someone fits into existing systems. But what if the real success is changing those systems so they work better for everyone? The UN Assembly Hall was unlike anything I had experienced. Representatives from countries I could barely locate on a map, interpreters speaking in dozens of languages, an atmosphere of serious international cooperation that made local politics seem trivial. By comparison, Riley would be addressing an audience that included ministers of technology, heads of development banks, and leaders of humanitarian organizations. Dr. Okafor introduced Riley with words that gave me chills. "Today we hear from someone who represents a new generation of technologists, people who understand that innovation without inclusion is simply another form of exclusion." At 19 years old, Riley Morrison has already demonstrated that the most powerful technology is that which serves those who need it most. Riley approached the podium with the confident bearing of someone who had learned to trust her own expertise. The presentation she delivered over the next 30 minutes was a masterclass in combining technical sophistication with humanitarian vision. She began not with statistics or technical specifications, but with a story that connected her personal experience to global challenges. 2 years ago, I watched my mother struggle with systems designed to confuse rather than help. That experience taught me that technology should reduce barriers, not create them. Today, I want to talk about how we can apply that principle to the 3.7 billion people worldwide who are still excluded from meaningful digital participation. Her first slide showed a split screen. On one side, the sleek interfaces that dominated Silicon Valley presentations. On the other, the reality of how most of the world's population actually accessed technology. On older devices with limited data plans in environments where privacy and security were constant concerns. We keep designing for users who look like us, think like us, and have access to the same resources we do, Riley explained. But meaningful digital inclusion requires designing for users who are nothing like us, and creating systems robust, enough to serve everyone in between. She demonstrated her new platform through a series of real-world scenarios. A health worker in rural Bangladesh using a simplified interface to track vaccination schedules on a device with intermittent connectivity. A small business owner in Lagos accessing microfinance applications through voice commands because traditional text-based systems didn't accommodate her limited literacy. A farmer in Guatemala receiving weather and crop price information through visual icons that transcended language barriers. But what set Riley's presentation apart wasn't just the technical solutions. It was her understanding of the human factors that determined whether technology succeeded or failed in real-world contexts. She had studied how social hierarchies affected technology adoption, how gender dynamics influenced access to digital tools, how economic pressures shaped the way people interacted with new systems. The question isn't whether we can build technology that works for everyone, she told the assembly. The question is whether we're willing to listen to everyone when we're building it. A delegate from Nigeria raised her hand. Ms. Morrison, these solutions look promising, but how do you ensure that communities aren't simply becoming dependent on external technology? How do we build local capacity for innovation and maintenance? Riley's response showed how much her thinking had evolved beyond her original insurance platform. That's exactly why this approach focuses on modular, open-source design. The goal isn't to export finished solutions, but to provide frameworks that local developers can adapt and improve. Every implementation includes training components that build local technical capacity. She pulled up examples of pilot programs where her methodology had been tested. In each case, local developers had not only successfully adapted her frameworks, but had improved them in ways that Riley hadn't anticipated. The platform had become a starting point for indigenous innovation rather than a finished product imposed from outside. The Brazilian representative asked about scalability across different economic contexts. Riley showed projections demonstrating how the same core principles could be implemented whether communities had access to cutting-edge infrastructure or were working with basic mobile networks. The beauty of designing for constraints, she explained, is that you create solutions that work everywhere. Technology that functions reliably in challenging conditions becomes incredibly powerful when deployed in optimal environments. But the question that revealed the depth of Riley's evolution came from the delegate representing indigenous communities. How do we ensure that digital inclusion doesn't mean cultural assimilation? How do we preserve local ways of knowing while providing access to global networks? Riley paused thoughtfully before responding. That's probably the most important question we can ask. True inclusion means creating space for different ways of thinking and knowing, not forcing everyone to adopt dominant cultural approaches to technology. The platforms we build should amplify local wisdom, not replace it. She showed examples of how her design principles had been adapted to support indigenous knowledge systems, interfaces that reflected local concepts of time and space, data structures that preserved traditional ways of categorizing information, privacy settings that respected community-based decision-making processes. The goal isn't to bring people into our version of the digital world, Riley concluded. It's to expand the digital world so there's room for all of us. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Delegates began lining up to speak with Riley before she had even finished packing up her materials. Development banks wanted to discuss funding for pilot programs. Technology ministers requested consultations on national digital inclusion strategies. Humanitarian organizations asked about partnerships for refugee and disaster response applications. But the conversation that moved me most happened with Dr. Sarah Kamani, a delegate from Kenya who worked on women's digital empowerment. Riley, she said, what you've presented today isn't just technology. It's a philosophy that respects human dignity. Too often, we see solutions that help people, but in ways that make them feel diminished. Your approach makes people feel empowered. That evening, as we walked through Times Square on our way to dinner, Riley was unusually reflective. The day's success should have felt triumphant, but I could see her processing something deeper. Mom, do you remember when I used to get frustrated because teachers said I thought about problems the wrong way? I nodded, remembering countless parent-teacher conferences where Riley's unconventional approaches were treated as deficiencies rather than strengths. I spent so many years trying to think like everyone else, trying to fit my mind into shapes that felt wrong. But today, in that room full of people trying to solve really complex problems, I realized that thinking differently isn't a bug. It's a feature. The problems that matter most need people who see them from angles nobody else has considered. She paused as we waited for a traffic light to change. I think that's what I want my legacy to be. not the specific software I build, but proof that the world needs all kinds of minds working on its biggest challenges. Over the following weeks, the opportunities that emerged from Riley's UN presentation created what could only be described as a movement. Young developers from around the world began reaching out, inspired by her approach to inclusive design. Universities started developing curricula based on her methodologies. Technology companies began reassessing their design processes to incorporate perspectives from underserved communities. Most significantly, Riley received an invitation that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The MacArthur Foundation wanted to discuss including her in their fellowship program for exceptional individuals who show potential for important future contribution in their fields. Riley, the program director explained during their video call, at 19, you've already demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking and social impact that we typically see from people much later in their careers. We're interested in supporting the next phase of your work. But what struck me about Riley's response wasn't excitement about the prestigious recognition or the substantial funding that came with MacArthur fellowships. It was her immediate focus on how she could use the opportunity to amplify other voices that had been marginalized in technology development. I appreciate the recognition, she told them, but I want to be clear that my success has been possible because other people believed in me when institutions said I wasn't worth the investment. If you support my work, I want to make sure we're creating pathways for other young people who are being overlooked because they don't fit traditional molds. The fellowship that was eventually structured included funding not just for Riley's continued research and development, but for a mentorship program that would identify and support other young innovators from underrepresented backgrounds. Tommy, Maria, and Alex became the first cohort of fellows, but they were quickly joined by young people from around the world who were developing solutions to problems in their own communities. A year later, I found myself in our old garage, which had been transformed from Riley's childhood tech lab into the headquarters of what was now being called the Morrison Initiative for Inclusive Innovation. The space buzzed with activity as young developers from 6 different countries collaborated on projects that addressed everything from accessible education technology to sustainable agriculture platforms. Riley, now 20, moved through the space with the easy authority of someone who had learned to trust her own vision, while remaining genuinely curious about other people's perspectives. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had worried about not fitting in. She had become someone who created spaces where not fitting in was exactly what qualified you to contribute. "Mom," she said, joining me as I watched the controlled chaos of innovation happening around us. "Do you remember when you used to tell me that my differences were gifts, not problems? You didn't believe me then. I thought you were just being a good mom, saying what moms are supposed to say. But now I understand what you meant. Every system that told me I was wrong, every teacher who said I thought about things incorrectly, every relative who suggested I lower my expectations, they were all preparing me to recognize problems that people who fit those systems couldn't see." She gestured toward the young people working around us. "Look at this. Marcus from Guatemala is designing voter education tools for communities with limited literacy. Aisha from Somalia is building platforms that help refugees maintain connections with family members. Chen from rural China is creating agricultural monitoring systems that work with basic smartphones. None of these solutions could have been developed by people who only understand privileged perspectives." As I watched these young innovators work, I realized that Riley had accomplished something far more significant than building successful technology or receiving prestigious recognition. She had proven that the most powerful force for positive change comes from people who refuse to accept limitations imposed by others' narrow vision of what's possible. The girl who had been told she had no future had not only created her own extraordinary future, she had made it possible for hundreds of other young people to imagine and create futures that nobody had thought to envision for them. That evening, As Riley prepared for a video call with a group of students in rural Kenya who were implementing her educational platforms, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. From that devastating graduation party where family members predicted her failure, to this garage where young people from around the world were collaborating on solutions to humanity's most persistent challenges. "Riley," I said as she tested her connection, "I need you to know something. I'm not proud of you because you proved the doubters wrong. I'm proud of you because you never let their doubt change who you were meant to be." She smiled with the confidence of someone who had learned to measure success not by other people's approval, but by the positive impact she could create in the world. "You know what I've figured out, Mom? The people who said I had no future weren't wrong because they misjudged my abilities. They were wrong because they had too small an imagination about what futures were possible. The future I'm building didn't exist in their definition of success, so they couldn't see it coming." As I watched my daughter connect with young innovators on the other side of the world, I realized that this story was never really about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving that the world needed exactly what she had to offer, exactly as she was. And now, thanks to her courage to trust her own vision despite everyone else's limitations, thousands of young people around the world were discovering that they too had gifts the world desperately needed. They just needed someone to help them see those gifts as strengths rather than problems. The future belonged to the people who refused to be contained by other people's definitions of possible. And my daughter was not just leading that future, she was making sure nobody got left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.